What do you think are life's biggest questions, and how does the cellular world contain the secrets to them?
There are two primary issues that we can focus on as life's biggest questions. One, I think, really relates to our topic about intelligence. I think the only remaining superlative mystery in science is the origin of consciousness. I think we have a lot of very interesting other topics and lots of mysteries and lots of puzzles and enigmas. But if you have to pick the number one, what is the major, really consequential unknown? It's the origin of consciousness.
Right.
The second is the question of individual purpose. And I think in this regard, understanding how cells operate, understanding that you are an amalgam of their consciousnesses that are so seamlessly connected to become your unique, exclusive consciousness is a gateway to understanding that purpose. And I'll be happy to explain it.
Did I infer from that correctly that you do believe an individual cell is conscious? And maybe it's important we define that term now, just before the podcast unfolds.
Yeah, Evan, I think that's really a great question. Yes, the answer is unequivocally yes. I do believe that every cell is conscious. And let me be clear that there's so much contention about what consciousness means.
Yeah.
And I think it is best to put aside the differences between folk psychology and academic rigor. The problem is academic rigor has taken us down many blind pathways, particularly with an insistence that you have to have a brain and you have to have neural cells in order to have consciousness. Folk psychology, when we talk about consciousness, we kind of exactly know what we mean by it. We sense, we feel, we respond, and particularly we have doubt. Consciousness is doubt. Being is doubt. And that's what cells teach us. Every cell dwells in ambiguity, in doubt. That's actually the condition of our lives. Our conscious experiences are not only the rich palette of things we feel and sense and appreciate, but it's continuous resolution of doubts. And we settle those doubts and then we open new ones. And so consciousness is the ability to perceive doubt and to act purposefully on it. This doesn't meet the same definition as every other scientist, but you can't get agreement among scientists.
Yes.
So every cell is conscious in that context. Every cell is intelligent, meaning it can sense the world around it, understand that there's ambiguity in that understanding, and act to resolve that doubt and make definitive, directed decisions to deploy assets, scant cellular resources, and or communicate, or both, to other cells in order to sustain themselves. And then I'll add one last participle to this to understand how cells interact and why cells are conscious. Cells have states of preference. This is something that really gets very little attention, but it's super important. Actually, a quick anecdote. It occurred to me because in my other life, I was a practicing physician, and in my role, the particular facet of medicine that I was in, I depended on certain reliable patterns on imaging in order to make a diagnosis. And those things are called Aunt Minnies. Aunt Minnies mean that I look at something and I know it's Aunt Minnie because it looks like Aunt Minnie. It seems rather simplistic, but when you're looking at images, let's say images of a disease pattern, let's take toxoplasmosis of the brain. So you can get this infection from cats, it's a parasite, and it has a very particular recurrent pattern in a specific set of cells that line the borders of what are called the cerebral ventricles. These are the fluid pathways that are inside of the brain. And if you see a disease process on an MRI scan or a CT scan that is at the level of those tissues right around the central CSF fluid pathways, and they form a certain pattern on imaging, which happens to be a kind of toxoplasmosis abscess, you know it's that organism. And the question that occurred to me and none of my colleagues was why? Why does it go there? Why can I reliably predict that that's the cause of this person's problems? And then it occurred to me that cells have preferences. And now there's extensive work that shows that cells act to defend certain states of satisfaction, preference. These are words that we don't normally assign to cells, but they're very important because they directly link to consciousness. The reason I say that is that to sustain a state of preference, a state of satisfaction, is an experience. And by saying what I'm saying now, we effectively work our way beyond Chalmers' heart problem, which is a brilliant idea, but has been a source of limitless obstruction in understanding consciousness. The context of cells that's really important to our discussion of context of consciousness is this. And it's very simple. A cell exists at a certain space, a certain spot. And of course, it's filled with mechanisms for sensory awareness. Every cell of your body, every single one, no matter how deep inside you, filled with means of sensing the environment. If there's any external environmental cue of any kind, let's just take a simple, mental model of a cell sitting there, and there's a pinpoint of light, and that pinpoint of light has got to get to the cell for the cell to sense it and know that there's light. But in order for that to happen, it must transit a media. It has to get there, and the cells live in a crowded, active environment. So their insides are crowded and active. So is their outside. There are interstitial spaces and so on. And then there's a time delay from the source, the pinpoint source of light, to the time the cell gets it. What does that mean? It means that there's no such thing as absolute objective reality for any cell. The cell can't actually know the value, the absolute value, if we were to measure it in our technical terms, of that pinpoint of light, because it never gets that information at its surface. And then even when it gets the information at its surface, guess what's got to happen? It has to transit its external membrane, its plasma membrane. Every single cell has a plasma membrane. But there's an important characteristic of a plasma membrane. It's not a dumb barrier. It's not a brick wall. It's a discriminating, active part of the conscious apparatus of the cell, which means that there's noise in crossing this active environment. The sum total is every bit of information that a cell has is ambiguous. That means because the information is not precise, it has to expend energy, scant energy, in order to measure it. And it measures it for two things: value, let's call it amplitude, the raw value of it. But then for valence. And valence is that hedonistic sense, the satisfaction, the preference that I mentioned. That valence is not like our sense of preference, like I prefer asparagus to broccoli. It's the cell's sense of maintaining, and the term is not homeostasis, it's homeoresis. An important distinction, and it's pedantic, but I want to emphasize it. We think of homeostasis as equilibrium with the environment. That's not what Claude Bernard meant. He actually had an active dynamic process in mind. But it's become equilibration. That's the one thing a cell can never do. It's always a state of dynamism. It's kinetic stability. It's That's its state of preference, which happens to be the state you'll find it in most often. But it will most often it will actively defend it and attempt to attain it. And to do so at the cells level is an experience. That's its hard problem right there.
Right.
There's no separation into two aliquots of consciousness. There's the easy things like the flow of chemicals and the hard things like abstraction. For a cell, they're all one and the same thing. Then we aggregate them as trillions, 100 trillion or more cells of different differentiated types and species into our total interpretation of consciousness. And then we get to experience it as with all of its varied ramifications. But these are varieties of a self-same thing, a start, a particular necessary reaction of a cell to ambiguity. And one last thing we need to cover to understand cells. And this, I think some of your listeners will find very odd. All the information that a cell has is self-produced. There's no objective information that a cell has. So I've said to you, in the mental, our mental image, we've got the point of light, we've got the cell. It reaches the external side of the cell, it transits the membrane, it gets inside, it's measured. But now that it's measured, that's what the cell has for information. It only has its measured assessment of that external environmental cue. There is no objective. There is matter and there is energy, but that's not information. It's only information when it gets inside the cell. This is a term called info-autopoiesis, which is not known to many. In fact, there's a man named Jaime, a wonderful researcher, Jaime Cardenas Garcia, and he's the originator of this terrific idea. But it's very explanatory of our living circumstances. Every single bit of information that we think we have self-produced inside. We do it at the single cellular level, and then we do it at our level. And before the reviewer, the listeners or viewers misapprehend, you can't say, well, I'm different at my whole cell level than I am at my cellular level. You got the order wrong. By definition, all reactions are at the cell and then aggregate to become the total you. There's no way around that in our living system. It's always, cells are the basic substratum of our lives. Every single metabolic, physiologic action and every thought is a cellular generated process.
Right.
And so we don't live in an objective reality. We live in a self-generated, self-produced interpretation of reality. And that's even true with our constructs. So I build a telescope and I can look out and I can see the rings of Saturn. And I feel pretty great that I understand the rings of Saturn. Yes, you understand your internally generated representational map of the rings of Saturn because you've interpreted the telescopic sight that tell us what you've seen on the telescope. We can't escape it. And this is our human consciousness.
I love that. What a response.
And it's very odd way of looking at it. But once you get there, it opens an entire pathway to understanding biology, which is very not neo-Darwinian.
Absolutely incredible. The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free